1991, newly qualified nurse Beverley Allitt murdered 4 children at Grantham and District Hospital. In a case unheard of in the UK, she purposely set about attacking those in her care. Her reign of terror left families torn apart by the deaths and numerous other children seriously injured, making this a crime that shook Britain.
Many of the youngsters who survived her attacks at Grantham Hospital were left severely mentally and physically handicapped.
For someone to be arrested for a murder is quite horrendous, but it was absolutely nothing to her, no emotion whatsoever, no fear, no anxiety, nothing.
One thing to say, and that's I want to know how she got the job in the first place.
She should never have worked in that hospital, never!
Beverley Allitt was left alone with her for a few minutes and called out that the child was blue, cyanosed and had stopped breathing.
Alarm over what was happening in the children's ward at Grantham Hospital surfaced in spring 1991. The sudden death of 7-week-old Liam Taylor was a first in a series of suspicious deaths or mysterious collapses.
Beverley Allitt hurt these children in order to gain some kudos, something for herself.
She becomes Britain's most prolific female serial killer this century.
I believe she is nothing but a cold-blooded murderer.
Beverley Allitt was employed for her role to care and protect. She did the exact opposite. Behind the facade of her nursing duties, she set about callously killing those who couldn't protect themselves. Child after child was collapsing on the ward. Her colleagues and the families were unaware they had a cold-hearted killer amongst them.
She got the job on the children's ward because they were grossly understaffed. Many of the parents in those early days spoke quite highly of her, so much so that the Phillips family made Beverley Allitt godmother to one of the twins. Somebody that worked hard on the ward, was always keen to volunteer, would change shifts at the drop of a hat, and were friendly towards parents.
The crimes committed by Beverley Allitt will be told through the eyes of those closest to the tragedy. Ward 4, Grantham and District Hospital. 5-month-old Paul Crampton has been on the ward for 3 days, having been admitted with a bad chest.
The doctor had asked for him to be admitted to the hospital just to keep an eye on him, really. And I think they described him at the time as a happy wheezer, so he clearly had a chest infection. And whilst we were concerned that he was in hospital, we weren't really worried. It seemed to us quite precautionary. He seemed quite happy, and clearly that was the right place to ensure that this chest infection didn't become any more serious.
Paul Crampton was admitted under Dr. Porter with what was considered to be a respiratory illness called bronchiolitis. He was on regular treatment for his breathing difficulties, but he wasn't ill, and he was getting better. Parents were happy. I felt that he could be discharged home sooner rather than later.
But as Paul is given his routine drug treatment, nurses notice a change in his condition.
We'd been home for a few hours. We were going back to Grantham Hospital on the Saturday evening to see him. When I got back to the hospital, I walked into a scene of quite horrendous, really. Paul was clearly in some distress, and when I walked in, they said that Paul had taken a turn for the worst. The doctor had been called and was on his way.
When I came to see Paul Crampton, I found him to be very ill with what we call circulatory shock. He was clammy, he was breathing short and fast.
Paul's condition rapidly deteriorates. Doctors are astounded by his decline and quickly battle to save him.
He needed immediate intravenous fluid and checking his blood for suspicions of low sugar and any other possible infection. With difficulty I managed to insert the drip. By that time, some of the results from the laboratory came back to say that he had significant low sugar. Fortunately, I had given the right fluid and he recovered fairly quickly.
For Dr. Nanyakara, Paul's sudden decline sticks in his mind. Over the past few weeks, Ward 4 has been prone to a number of unusual occurrences. It all started just over 5 weeks ago with the unexplained death of a 7-week-old baby, Liam Taylor.
He was taken into hospital because he got bronchiolitis, he got a winter cold, if you like. The parents, thinking that he's in safe hands, decide that they'll go home and have a bite to eat. And when they arrive back, they're quite distressed to see their child naked, blue, and obviously having difficulty in breathing. During the course of that evening, the child recovers, and by the next day is quite well again. The next night, Beverley Allitt is given the job of specialing. Now, what specialing is one-to-one nursing. And she's given the role of looking after Liam. The mother, who's quite drained by this time, goes to bed, has a fairly early night. Father looks in at the child at about midnight. Dad notes that the oxygen level in the blood is 99%, which is almost perfect. At about 3:15 in the morning, nursing staff wake him to tell him that the child's relapsed. The doctor speaks to him, tells him that the child has effectively died and had stopped breathing for an hour and 15 minutes, but they'd managed to resuscitate. The child was being kept alive by ventilation, and during the course of that morning, Mum and Dad talked between themselves and eventually asked the doctors to withdraw life support on the child, and the child sadly died in their arms that day.
When I found that the cause of death was what was described as massive heart attack, I just couldn't believe it.
Liam's death concerned Dr. Nanyakara so much, he went to the lengths of requesting a second opinion.
I kept asking myself, did I miss it? Did I miss this diagnosis? But looking back even at that time, on reflection, I did not have any evidence to suggest that he died of a heart attack the way pathologist had described. I did write saying that I cannot accept this cause of death given, and therefore could they please consider carrying out a second post-mortem to confirm or change the diagnosis they had come up with. My requests were completely rejected.
Liam's decline came just 2 days after a new nurse joined the ward, Beverley Allitt.
She had recently qualified as a nurse with one of the lesser nursing qualifications.
I believe she came initially as a trainee nurse, and subsequently she was appointed as what you call a sick children's nurse.
There were no other applicants. I think what they were really looking for on Ward 4 were experienced children's nurses, but there was a shortage and they couldn't get them. So Beverley Allitt was taken on, if you like, as second best.
She helped other nurses in providing nursing care for children who came under our care.
Many of the parents in those early days spoke quite highly of her.
Now, since Liam's death, a general sense of unease has begun to spread amongst some staff. Just 2 weeks after Liam, another boy, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick, dies suddenly in their care. Then, days later, a baby girl, Kaylee Desmond, collapses. Their rapid decline left the medical staff puzzled. And now, doctors are fighting to save another baby, Paul Crampton. Paul's condition has improved overnight. His drip is removed and he appears visibly better. But this doesn't last for long.
The second attack that Paul had was on Sunday the 24th, and I recall it coincided with them removing the drip.
He was quite shut down, and I had significant difficulties getting a drip into a vein.
Once again, Paul has declined rapidly. Doctors are confused by his illness.
Grey, clammy, cold, lethargic, clear in distress. And this time he took longer to recover. And I was becoming extremely frustrated by the fact that I couldn't gather information, and quite clearly the hospital staff were not able to tell me why Paul was having these attacks.
Doctors now fight to save the 5-month-old boy. Eventually he stabilises, but isn't out of the woods.
This time he took longer time, few hours before he recovered. Again, the blood tests revealed low sugar, and we had corrected the low sugar with extra glucose.
Paul is stabilised for a second time, but doctors demand more tests to find the root of the problem. Meanwhile, Beverley Allitt goes off duty for 3 days, and Paul recovers.
When I came back that evening, I found, to my somewhat amazement, that Paul still remained in the ward. I then found that he remained in the ward for next few days, and when I asked my colleague, he felt that as he was stable with discussions of the regional centre, that they were happy for him to be kept at Grantham under his care.
A new day on the ward. Beverley Allitt is back on duty. Routine starts with the usual admissions and checks. Doctors haven't had any more incidents over the last 3 days, but the recent spate is keeping them on edge. Paul Crampton's blood test results will arrive any day, and as he waits, Dr. Nanyakara searches for other explanations.
We had our weekly teaching round, and we actually discussed Paul Crampton as to the possible causes of recurrent low sugar episodes in infants like Paul.
As Dr. Nanyakara takes his class, Paul's parents sit by his bedside. Since the weekend, he has been making steady progress.
After the second attack, Paul obviously was going to remain in hospital. We had no idea, and it was never discussed how long. It was only discussed that there were going to be a series of tests which hopefully were going to establish why Paul had suffered 2 hypoglycemic attacks. Regular tests of his blood were being carried out to check the sugar level. So really for a few days we were living by these regular blood tests to see his blood sugar was okay, and of course once it was okay there was quite a relief, and then you waited for the next test.
But as Dr. Nanyakara's class gets into full swing, the calm is about to be broken.
We got a call from the nurses saying that Paul had collapsed again, and we had to abandon the meeting, and Dr. Porter then rushed to Paul.
Panic strikes Grantham Hospital. Over the last few weeks, children have died suddenly or fallen extremely ill. The staff have no answers for their rapid decline. Paul Crampton, originally brought in for a chest complaint, has been on the brink of death twice. Now, when doctors believe he's just pulling through, Paul stops breathing again. Beverley Allitt has just returned after 3 days off.
I said to the staff, I'm going to the hospital canteen to get some food, I'll be back shortly. I walked back to find Paul having another hypoglycemic attack.
He saw that his son was blue, was twitching, and was quite clearly in yet another attack.
Called the staff who came and obviously administered treatment to Paul.
And Dr. Porter then rushed to Paul. He then stabilized the child and made arrangements for him to be transferred to Queen's Medical Centre as a matter of emergency.
Since Paul's admission to the ward, Beverley Allitt has been assigned to give him special care. Now, with their son gravely ill, Paul's parents are relieved when Allitt accompanies them to the other hospital.
Kath went with him as an emergency admission to Queen's Medical Centre, and Nurse Beverley Allitt volunteered to go with Kath. She attended in the ambulance with Kath as it rushed off to Queen's Medical Centre.
As Paul Crampton leaves Grantham, the consultants are in a state of disbelief. Patients are collapsing and they have no clear reasons. Dr. Porter has taken another sample from Paul. With 3 near-death experiences, his blood tests must draw some conclusions. Now, despite the collapses, they try to return to normality. But this is soon broken. In the following days, 2 more boys collapse. 5-year-old Bradley Gibson stops breathing after a drip is attached for antibiotics. Then, 2-year-old Yik Hung Chan suddenly convulses after being left alone with a nurse. Remarkably, they are revived and transferred to another hospital.
So it was complete demoralized, depressed state of affairs. In spite of all these continuing activities that were going on, we carried on our work. We offered our very best to those who were in need, who came under our care.
Nurses are now also checking medical records for clues. In the meantime, twin girls Becky and Katie Phillips are admitted. Beverley Allitt is on duty again.
Where both twins were in the hospital under my care with what was considered as a non-specific illness. On inquiry, I found that Becky was discharged home that morning.
Allitt was seen in her room prior to her release, and at about 4:30 in the afternoon, the parents are allowed to take the child home. Within a couple of hours or so, the child becomes grisly, and the GP's called. Mum and Dad dash with the child to Grantham Hospital, where Becky's pronounced dead on arrival.
Becky Phillips has lost her fight for life, and her twin sister Katie is now gravely ill after coming into the ward as a precaution. As doctors now fight to save Katie Phillips, a 6-year-old boy, Michael Davidson, plays down the road with a friend.
I mean, he was round at a friend's house with an adult friend of ours, and the adult was messing about with an air rifle in the friend's house, not knowing that it was loaded. As he was playing around with it, it went off, and the pellet ricocheted around the room and entered into Michael's chest cavity.
Michael is rushed to Grantham Hospital, operated on and taken to Ward 4. His injuries are serious but not life-threatening.
It was thought at the time that there was be no damage, and that it was just a matter of removing the pellet.
Surgeons had taken him to the theatre, removed the pellets, and after recovery from the anesthesia was transferred for further recovery to the pediatrics ward.
As Michael makes a steady recovery, Beverley Allitt becomes one of the nurses taking care of him.
Then we were assured that everything was fine and perfectly normal, and that he would, very rapidly recover, because it was only a very minor operation.
But 2 days after Michael's admittance, horror strikes.
Suddenly Faye got a phone call to say, "Get up here straight away, Michael's in trouble," and asked for an explanation, and said, well, he's blacked out, and he was arching his back and just collapsed on the bed.
During the course of his treatment, he'd been injected about 6 times with a particular sort of drug, and on the 7th occasion, when he was being injected with it, he cyanosed, went blue and stopped breathing.
Doctors fight to save his life. Meanwhile, Beverley Allitt continues her duties, having just prepared Michael's antibiotics for his latest injection.
Michael had had a cannula in his left hand since the day before, and had had several injections through it, and been perfectly calm. So why would he suddenly have an anaphylactic shock at a needle on the 2nd day, being put into a cannula not stuck into him?
I found he was shaking, making unusual jerky movements of his limbs. He was breathing hard and heavy. His heartbeat was dropping, and virtually dropping to almost 0. I then called for extra help, gave first aid measures, provided oxygen, but within few minutes he recovered and became stabilized.
As Michael lies very poorly at Grantham, Paul Crampton is now making a quick recovery at another hospital.
And I remember asking to see the consultant that was responsible for Paul's case, and he said, you can take Paul home. And I said, well, how can we take Paul home then, because we don't know why he was ill in the first place. In the end, I did take him home quite late one evening without any real answers.
As Paul leaves hospital, against all odds, Michael also pulls through. The reason for their collapses remains a mystery. In the space of 7 weeks, 8 children have suspiciously collapsed on Ward 4. Some now lie dead, and the consultants have no medical explanation. Now, since Michael's decline, 3 more boys have suspiciously collapsed. All had been admitted with minor complaints, but were shortly found on the brink of death. Somehow, they are saved by staff again. The doctors are now in a race against time. Is there a common thread? A vital clue to the mystery is about to unfold. The results from Paul Crampton's blood finally arrive.
Dr. Porter had received the results of Paul Crampton to suggest that he had very high insulin levels in his blood in some of the samples. We had a meeting, myself, Dr. Porter and Mrs. Moira Onions, to discuss our continuing growing concerns about these collapses, which were unexplained and unexpected. So we did sit down and put our thoughts together and collated whatever information was available.
As the doctors hold an urgent meeting, a 15-month-old little girl, Claire Peck, is admitted to Ward 4.
She came in with no more than an asthmatic attack. She'd been in hospital the week before. On this particular occasion, she didn't respond to the usual treatment. So it was decided that she would be taken down to the treatment room.
Claire's condition is deteriorating rapidly. As preparations are made, Beverley Allitt is left watching her.
Beverley Allitt was left alone with her for a few minutes and called out that the child was blue, cyanosed and had stopped breathing.
Ward 4 at Grantham and District Hospital is in a crisis. Over the last few weeks, too many children have been falling gravely ill, for no reason. And now, as the doctors call an urgent meeting to get to the root of the problem, another baby collapses.
Beverley Allitt was left alone with her for a few minutes and called out that the child was blue, cyanosed and had stopped breathing. One of the other nurses worked on her and managed to recover the child.
Staff managed to bring the baby girl round, but their efforts are short-lived. As Dr. Porter leaves to talk to the parents, Beverley Allitt is left to care for the baby once more.
And he's astounded when within minutes the shout goes up that this little girl stopped breathing again. So he goes back and he works on the little girl for some considerable time. And to quote his words, he said to me, "It felt as if there was something preventing me saving the life of the child."
Later in the evening, I heard from Dr. Porter that Claire Peck, who actually was under my care previously for recurrent episodes of asthma, had been admitted that evening under his care and unfortunately had died within few hours of admission.
The number of unexplained deaths has now risen to 4. 9 other children have also collapsed in a matter of weeks. Doctors' concerns are now turning to suspicion. Dr. Porter draws up a list of the casualties to find any similarities. Blood and fluids have now been taken to try and find a cause. And as they wait for results, Dr. Nanya Kara writes an urgent letter to management spelling out their concerns.
I wrote a letter on the 22nd to hospital management expressing our serious concerns and anxieties about series of collapses that were going on, and also mentioning about the result which Dr. Porter had found of Paul Crampton's abnormal blood result.
As staff wait for a response to Dr. Nanyakara's letter, it now comes to light a vital key on the ward is also missing.
3 days before the Liam Taylor death, the key to the fridge on Ward 4 in the children's ward had gone missing. The last person to have had it was Beverley Allitt. Now the significance of this key is that it opens the fridge where the insulin's kept. When she was asked about it, she said that she'd given it to another nurse, but she couldn't remember who. And despite that, no internal inquiry was ever conducted.
Paul Crampton's blood has massive levels of a drug that shouldn't have been administered. Doctors are baffled by the results. A key to the drugs cabinet is missing, and the vital letter written for management has only just been received, more than a week late. The devastating facts make for a shocking read. The hospital now decide to involve the police.
I got called to Grantham Hospital to speak to some senior managers and doctors. It was apparent that we were dealing with something major with a large number of events which needed urgent attention, urgent action. We had to move quickly because these incidents were still ongoing.
Now at that meeting there were the two local paediatricians, Porter and Nanyakara, who were almost diametrically opposed to each other. Porter was saying that he felt that there were 13 or 14 children on that ward whose collapses were unexplained, and Nanyakara on the other hand took the opposite view, that although they were unexplained, they were probably due to natural causes. However, they did agree that one particular child, a child called Paul Crampton, could not be very easily explained. In those early stages, nobody knew who was responsible, nobody really knew what had happened. You sit in a meeting like that wondering how you're going to cope with this, because there's obviously going to be a need to trawl through many medical records and have some understanding of medicine and procedures. And in those early stages, I suppose it's fair to say that there is an element of fear in when you realise what it is that you're going to take on.
Detective Superintendent Clifton needs a medical expert to study each case. Officers have to see if there are grounds to dig deeper. Have these children been murdered? The findings come as a surprise to some.
David Hull was asked by me to be my expert, to look at the case files of the children and to provide for me a report which would either suggest that a crime had been committed or that these collapses were something that was a natural occurrence. But his report into the 13 cases that he'd looked at suggested that of the 13, 10 were natural causes, 2 others were unexplained and worthy of further investigation, but would probably be down to natural causes, and 1 child, there was no clinical explanation and was worthy of further investigations.
That 1 child is Paul Crampton, now safe and well at home, but his blood test could hold the key to unravelling the deaths on Ward 4.
There were over 40,000 milliunits per litre of insulin in this child's blood, and in fact I think it's the second highest ever recorded in the world, or it certainly was in 1991.
The police officer from Grantham Police Station came into my office with a lady, and he said that she was a representative of Grantham Hospital, and then he told me that he had reason to believe that Paul's illness was a result of the maladministration of drugs. And I remember precisely what I said. That would explain a lot, wouldn't it?
So for the very first time, now this is 10 or 12 days into the inquiry, we have some evidence that somebody has poisoned one of the children using insulin. Fortunately, the doctor who admitted Becky took blood, and again we managed to trace that blood and have it examined, and that was found to contain almost 10,000 milliunits per litre of insulin. So here was a second child that we could actually show had been poisoned with insulin.
Blood samples are now showing massive levels of insulin. Have some of the children been poisoned? This is now a major investigation. Everyone involved is questioned.
My role at the time was to go with other officers to Ward 4 at Grantham Hospital to speak to nurses, doctors, parents of the children at the hospital, anyone really, because we were in the process at that stage of gathering as much information as we could to try and establish what had happened and if indeed any criminal offences had occurred.
At the same time, one of the PCs working within the incident room was plotting who was on duty or who was available on the ward at the time of each of these collapses.
An event, who the patient was, what date the event occurred on, who was the nurse involved in any treatment, were any injections given, and if so, by whom. And as a consequence of that, it became apparent that one nurse stuck out as being there when these incidents either occurred or immediately that the child collapsed.
Okay.
4 children have died and 9 collapsed on Ward 4. It all started 10 weeks ago. What began as unavoidable tragedies have now turned into something much more sinister. Police have been in a race against time. After weeks of detective work, they now have their culprit.
The turning point and the shock of the news that's the cause of some of the collapses was someone had been harming children became apparent around 4 weeks or 5 weeks later, when the police felt that insulin had been administered to Paul Crampton, very likely by one of the nurses in the ward. And that was a great shock.
My first reaction was a bit of relief because, I was frightened that we'd got a son that had got a medical problem. That was something that was going to affect the rest of his life. Of course, then there's another problem to deal with, that you now realise someone's been trying to harm your child.
Strangely, as police investigate Ward 4, the attacks stop. And after a few weeks, all the evidence leads to one person.
The chart showed that on every occasion that there was a child collapsing, Allitt was on duty.
It didn't specifically identify individual children that she dealt with, but it just showed what happened on the dates and times that she was involved in holding the fridge key, for instance.
So 3 weeks into the inquiry, I decided that I would have Beverley Allitt arrested.
As 23-year-old Beverley Allitt becomes the main suspect, she shows little emotion. 4 children now lie dead and a further 9 seriously injured.
She showed no emotion whatsoever. She certainly didn't appear to be worried, nervous, anxious, agitated, nothing. She gave absolutely nothing away in the course of the interviews and gave me nothing at that stage to suspect that she'd committed any of these offences.
During those 2 days of interviews, she answered questions but distanced herself from the events, often saying, I wasn't there then, I wasn't even on duty when that one happened.
Beverley Allitt's arrest is greeted with mixed emotion. To some parents and staff, she appears to be the model nurse, but police are piecing together another side to this mild-mannered carer. For Stuart Clifton and his team, the evidence is mounting. The finger points to her. They just have to prove it.
The twin sister of Becky Phillips suffered squeeze injuries, had broken ribs that had been missed by the local radiographers, but Philip Small, the consultant radiographer at Queen's, managed to pick it up. Another child, Kaylee Desmond, air had been injected under the arm, which showed on one of the x-rays, which was picked up. So there were a variety of things that were being done to these children.
As the case against Allitt gathers pace, police search the family home and find some telling clues.
There was a hypodermic syringe, there was a hospital pillowcase, and there was a children's exercise book with the words allocations book on the outside. I think it's fair to say that at the time of the arrest, none of us realised the significance of this particular book.
But despite these signs, police have to release Allitt without charge. She can no longer work at the hospital, but is free.
When we looked at this allocations book, what it actually was a rough notebook that was kept by the ward sister, and in it she wrote down the children who needed care or special care and the nurse that was allocated their care.
She was either attending to, injecting, finding the collapse of the incident with the child concerned. It was basically impossible for it to be anybody else.
The details in this book could now be a vital part of the investigation, and other evidence of samples and x-rays are now coming to the fore. Police are in a race against time. They must build a strong case against Allitt before she strikes again.
We think by this time that we're building quite a reasonable case against Beverley Allitt, except you have to remember that we've still got David Hull's initial report that says that of the kids that he's looked at, 10 of them at least are natural causes and probably some of the others as well. He agreed to take away all of the evidence that we collected in statement form and compare it with the medical notes, the doctors and nursing notes, and re-examine and come up with a new conclusion about the collapse of the children. And that had some difficulties in the sense that we were still collecting bits of evidence, so he was being bombarded with bits as we went along. And it wasn't until November of 1991, some 5 months or so later, that he was in a position to say that each and every one of these collapses is unnatural.
Months of frustration for the police finally end with a result. 6 months on, Beverley Allitt is arrested once more, never to step out of custody again.
That arrest was peculiar in the sense that she was charged, went to the cell, immediately fell asleep and had to be woken the next morning, which I found rather astonishing for somebody that was going to face some horrendous charges in court the following day.
It was absolutely nothing to her, no emotion whatsoever, no fear, no anxiety, nothing. One of the times that she was at the police station, I actually went and saw her in the cell, and she'd lifted her top because she'd lost quite a lot of weight, and she was sort of saying, "Oh, I've lost weight, do you think I look better?" and all this, as if we were long lost friends.
And elements of Beverley Allitt's true nature and personality now start to filter through.
And her medical background, even going back to the days of school, were of a child that came with plasters and bandages and slings and things that normal kids just wouldn't. She complained that she couldn't pass water, and she was admitted to the hospital at Peterborough. It was clear that she had urine retention and that she had a temperature. What concerned the staff at Peterborough Hospital was that her pulse didn't rise when she had a temperature, and eventually they concluded that what she was actually doing was warming up the thermometer. When she complained of pain in the breasts, they examined her quite closely and found needle tracks and concluded that she was actually injecting her own breasts with water. While she'd been on police bail, she'd been living with a family called Jobson down at Peterborough. And Beverley struck up quite a nice relationship with Jonathan Jobson. One particular day they were going off to the market, and before they went, Beverley made Jonathan a drink of squash. When he got to market, he complained of feeling quite ill and collapsed. He was taken into Peterborough Hospital, where it was concluded that he had a high insulin count. There's a whole host of lies and manipulation of people.
Beverley Allitt's trial is long and complicated. Eventually, after months of evidence, she is charged with 4 counts of murder and 9 attempted murders for attacking the children on Ward 4. She is given 13 life sentences and shows no emotion and no remorse.
I saw her at Rampton Hospital about 3 or 4 weeks after her transfer there. At that time she made admissions in respect to 9 of the 13 that she'd been convicted of. She wouldn't admit that she'd been involved in any way with the 2 Phillips children, but undoubtedly she was. Some of them will never know precisely what she did.
This admission of guilt is a small window into Allitt's psyche, but she was never to speak of the attacks again.
I don't want to talk about it.
Why she opened up, we will never know. And as for the motive...
Post-conviction, there were reports from a number of people that suggested that she was suffering from Munchausen syndrome. Now, Munchausen syndrome is a syndrome where people like to get attention. In other words, they're attention seekers and they'll do anything to gain attention. When it moves on and you cause injury to somebody so that you get attention as the carer, it becomes Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
I think it is very unfair for anyone to label her as suffering from Munchausen syndrome, because that virtually minimizes her horrendous criminal actions she carried out as criminal who is cold-blooded, calculating, deceptive, manipulative and deadly.
Beverley Allitt's case was the first in the UK where a nurse was linked to killing due to Munchausen's by proxy. Whether this is partly the reason, the fallout from this horrific crime is clear. Shortly after news broke, the hospital, its staff and patients became victims of the fallout. Ward 4 was quickly closed, facilities moved to a nearby hospital, and the two main consultants made redundant.
When they found that Beverley Allitt could be charged with these allegations, they wanted to hand over the paediatric services to Queen's Medical Centre.
They closed down Ward 4 at the hospital and removed all the services to Nottingham. I think that was an overreaction, but that was the decision of the regional medical authorities. I think it did a disservice to the people of Grantham.
The Clothier report shortly followed. An inquiry into how and why this tragedy occurred and whether it could have been prevented.
We did not and could not believe that we could have a criminal amongst us masquerading as a healthcare professional. So my message is, think of the unthinkable. He made about 7 or 8 recommendations out of the total 13 recommendations on recruitment and selection process of nursing. I sincerely believe it should not only apply to nurses, it should apply to all healthcare professionals.
Within this inquiry, the reason that people were never sure whether there were crimes committed was because all of the notes that were made up, and there were countless. There were nursing notes, there were doctors' notes, there were notes from physiotherapists and what have you, were always based on what Beverley Allitt told them.
Beverley Allitt callously murdered those who needed her care. Sadly, 4 children needlessly lost their lives. The 9 who survived have thankfully recovered. Paul Crampton and Michael Davidson had no lasting side effects. Allitt felt no remorse or shame for her victims and thrived on the attention of those who trusted her the most, parents and colleagues. She played them so well, they never suspected her sinister intentions, which begs the question, could this happen again?
All you can hope to do is to identify the people that have the potential for doing this sort of thing.
In various guises, there are Beverley Allitts all over the place. There needs to be much more rigid vetting procedures of staff entering into the service, and much more rigorous and careful monitoring of staff who are actually on the job. I accept that isn't going to stop every case. You're never ever going to do that if somebody is determined enough to ever try at it. But at least every one case that is prevented is one case that we can be thankful for.
If we remove Beverley Allitt from the picture and consider this to be some new bug, some new superbug, some kind of faulty drug, a batch of drugs that have been badly prepared, the results would have been the same. It's about the hospital's ability to deal with a developing crisis. And The well-meaning medical staff were not prepared to deal with that. That wasn't part of their training. They deal with ill people, not a pattern of unusual circumstances, which in this case was caused by Beverley Allitt.
I was satisfied that Miss Allitt would be convicted on the basis of the evidence. The fact that she still remains in prison, I think, is fair.
She has committed atrocious crimes on most vulnerable and helpless children. I believe she is nothing but a cold-blooded murderer. I sincerely hope and wish that I nor any health professional will ever come across anybody like Beverley Allitt ever in their life.
And there's one thing I am very certain of, is Beverley Allitt should never be free.